come to the 1996 coup.
Yes, yeah, the 1966 coup, yes.
1966 coup.
Yes.
What are the controversies that flow out of that?
Okay, start with the January, because I mean, as I say, I always refer to the two coups as being part of a continuum. I think it is often dangerous to separate both events as separate standalone events. Yes, they happen different times, but they are part of a continuum, which is important to discuss, to have a single narrative.
One narrative onto the other, didn't
absolutely.
Yeah.
Basically, a very summary about the Nigerian 1966 coup. A group of left-leaning, radically oriented officers who had probably had motivation from the Nasserite events before this, felt that felt that there was a need to effect change in government by force, pure and simple. And the real theory is that the planning had started since 1964, and that in fact there were many names called about, but then none of those have actually had pure, strong evidential basis, including Odumegwu Ojukwu was actually cited as being part of the 1964 plot, which there's no genuine evidence in support of that. But then the fact remains that by 1965, late 1965, the plot to overthrow the government of Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa was well in sway, and thus by January 15, 1966, the coup took place in several centers there, including in the west at Ibadan, in Lagos, and indeed in Kaduna, such that the premier of the north, Sir Ahmadu Bello, was killed. The Prime Minister in Lagos was killed, and indeed several senior army officers were killed. Now, part of the controversy being that, one, the preponderance of the plotters was from the eastern part of the country, or should I say of Igbo stock, because certain members of in fact Nzobo, for instance, was from the western region, although of Igbo stock, because obviously Asaba and Opanam were actually part of the old western region. And the fact that of those assassinated, there were no deaths in eastern Nigeria, and also there was a theory that even one or two of the plotters, possibly, and of which Ifajana is cited as being one, had actually conferred or had seen the premier of the eastern region, Dr. Michael Apara, and seemingly to seek either to confer, to consult, or at least to keep him brief, which is absolutely no evidence supports that other than just conjectural accounts. But the fact does remain, which is factual, is that there was no violent action taken in eastern Nigeria. First, after the coup by January 16, when the events had taken place, the fact remained that the coup plotters were effectively in charge of the main centers, although General Aguiyi-Ironsi actually led the quelling of the rebellion in Lagos, because he ostensibly was a target of the plotters. Now, the long and short of it is that several Northern Army officers have been killed. The two key Northern politicians have been killed. Yoruba senior army officer had been killed, and only one Igbo army officer was killed. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Onebu, who it is said by some simply ran into them at the wrong time, and he was not actually part of the list of those to be assassinated. Now, as the story goes, this was an Igbo coup. And it being an Igbo coup, as time went on, before eventually the plotters now surrendered themselves to the government of General Aguiyi-Ironsi, who had in the interim taken over power from the politicians, and that's a totally separate story altogether. It's such a conundrum of events. By the time he handed over power, and then the plotters were then detained by the government of General Aguiyi-Ironsi. Part of the grudge held by those who felt aggrieved by the January 15, 1966 coup, which pure and simple were political elements in the north, was that there was no prompt trial and assassination, or should I say no prompt trial and execution, which is the natural consequence of treason of the plotters. And it is also said that the General Aguiyi-Ironsi did not help his case, that he did by enacting decree number 34, which essentially turned Nigeria into a unitary state. And this was seen by some to be the last straw. Hence, the July 1966 coup was a revenge coup which took place to avenge the deaths of senior northern elements. And let's not forget that, most importantly for the army, was the killing of Lieutenant Colonels Palm, Largema, and most importantly, Maimalari, who was very well loved and respected in the army. I mean, a true spit and polish officer who, in fact, Major General Welby Evera, before he left, he had been his preference for the position, for the appointment as General Officer commanding the Nigerian Army, but obviously he was far too junior in the ranking, but he had been cited as a future prospect. So he was greatly respected in the army, so that the army actually felt more aggrieved by the killing of army officers, senior army officers, and indeed the killing of politicians, of northern politicians. I mean, let's be honest, there was jubilation across the country when the January 15, 1966 coup took place. There was. There's ample evidence of that, even in the north, because there were several northern elements who actually felt that the government of the Sadana was oppressive. But then, within the army, there was more discontent at the killing of senior army officers, hence the revenge coup. Now, the revenge coup essentially started at Abeokuta, in which several Igbo officers were killed and spread out all across the country, and the connotation of this being that, in fact, it is cited that there is evidence that some officers, in fact, a key element of the plotters had intended a secession of the north from Nigeria. The word Araba had been touted, and in fact, it is said there was actually a northern flag had actually been hoisted, by the plotters. But then it is said, which, as I said, this is for which there is no, there's several bits of narrative and several bits of evidence out there which sometimes contradict each other. It is said that on the advice of the British High Commissioner, the North was advised not to take that step, and in fact the political
at that point, everybody was looking down the barrel of a gun, weren't they? Because what had been the federal state was then unravelling.
Absolutely. And the thing is that it is said that what is definitely clear is that some of the plotters had actually intended for secession. But it is then said that the British High Commissioner now advised the plotters of the probably the folly of taking that course of action, because it was obviously done in the heat of anger, as you could probably see from the actions taken by the plotters themselves. Several people killed. There was a complete carnage. It was almost near anarchy in the country. Civilians were being taken out of planes and shot. And I could go on and on. And the thing is, even before ANC was overthrown, violence had actually erupted in the north. Civilians were getting killed in the north. Eastern Nigerian civilians, and I think it's clear to make clear it wasn't just Igbos, but Eastern Nigerian civilians had been killed extensively in the north. And this now segued into the army's own operational, operational control, in that the army now took upon themselves to effect action. And the thing is, what a lot of the senior officers have said, they have not denied that the killings took place. All they have said is that, we could not control the boys. And there is an element of truth in that, but whether they actually turn the blind eye to that deliberately and is a separate issue altogether. But there is an element of truth in the fact that they could not. There was definitely an atmosphere of anarchy. And in fact, many officers have said, look, if we tried to stop them, we could have been killed ourselves. Now, there is truth, because Colonel Adekunle at the time was actually bayoneted by some of his officers for trying to protect Igbos on the train. So there is truth in that. But there is also truth that it might have been controlled on a certain level. Well, that's a separate issue. Anyway, the fact remains that the implications of that coup were that it was a permanent rift. A permanent rift was created, one, within the army, and two, within the Nigerian polity. It was the January 15 coup.
Out of which Biafra wasn't inevitable, but then became more likely.
Became extremely likely. Biafra was not inevitable, there's no doubt about it, because even, may his soul rest in peace, Colonel Odumeji Ojukwu is gone. But I wonder if in his own quiet time, he did not think to himself that maybe there was an opportunity, even though I do think that my personal perspective, which is that the federal side could have acted in better faith with the dealings at Aburi. But somehow
Was Ojukwu interested in national power? Because his army from Biafra went well beyond the borders at a certain point.
What I will say is, that's interesting, because my father actually fought on the Banjo in Benin, so I can have quite a bit of a personal perspective on this. But what I would think is that at the time Aburi was being discussed, Ojukwu had no interest in national power. That I can say for certain, and that's actually the relevant period we're talking about. Ojukwu's primary interest was the protection of Eastern interest, and I will give him full credit for the part he played in leading, essentially acting as a voice for Eastern Nigeria. Then he had now, as to whether he had any personal designs, well, honestly, I don't think anyone has any clear evidence of this, because there's so many accounts. You would have to speak to Colonel Banjo
Yeah.
Or, to actually understand whether Colonel Ojukwu had any such genuine designs.
Yeah.
He's never expressed that he had such. The only evidence that we have of Ojukwu's mindset was a so-called agreement, handwritten, between which he was given to Banjo on his way to the Midwest, which talked about the East Biafra providing support for the eventual new republic that would emerge from the takeover of the Midwest and the West. Well, that in itself does not suggest anything otherwise than that the Biafra was lending its arms and men to the effort that Banjo was leading.
Yeah.
That's all that says. Whether he had any designs, what can we say? I don't know. I don't think anyone actually knows.